Hello everybody, welcome to this talk. This talk is actually a repeat of a talk I gave originally 2.5 years ago in Amman in Jordan. Together with some wonderful colleagues, we just completed a really exciting book, a bilingual terminology handbook of social work terms, English, Arabic, Arabic, English. And this talk was presented at that book launch in Amman. And the plan was always to record it. We wanted to make a recording of the talk and we weren't able to on the day. So 2.5 years later, I'm now re-recording this talk for you guys. A really exciting project sponsored and supported by these wonderful 4 organizations whose logos you can see on the top left-hand corner of this presentation. I'm going to try and give this presentation as I did back in Amman 2.5 years ago. So let me start by saying a few words about the project itself. The project was English for Social Work, a bilingual terminology handbook. It was an adapted and an extended and a translated version of an earlier project. So our project, the project done by our 3 collaborators and myself, that was different, but related to an earlier project. And the earlier project I did on my own, and it's this book here. This is a book that responded to a need for English language teaching and learning resources. So we had so much social work literature in Germany, but we didn't really have language tools to help students shifting their language, working from one language and translating their ideas into another. So there was a lack of tools for reference, a lack of tools for language learning. Before I speak about that book, maybe it's nice if I take a step back and say, this is a tool for social workers to use. What is social work? What is social work? Well, it's a profession. It's a pretty well-developed profession. Even if you go back 100 years, you can easily find social work, and it's already recognizable as social work, say, at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's a well-developed profession. It has a distinct professional identity. It has a distinct profile. What do I mean when I say that? Well, for example, it has its own knowledge. It has its own knowledge base. There's particular skills, competencies that social workers have, and they're quite distinct. And it also has a distinct way of seeing the world. It has a distinct value base, a particular attitude or stance of the worker, what we find good and desirable or not. So a distinct profession with its own knowledge base, with its own skills, and with its own values. Repeating that question, what is social work? An official answer to this question would be one answer that was produced collectively by a great number of social work experts. The International Federation of Social Workers, together with the International Association of Schools of Social Work, considered this question a few years back. Actually, they've considered it a number of times, 3 times in total. And this is the 3rd and final definition that they collectively put together. Utterly fascinating to read if you wish to have an immediate and compact definition of what social work is. What is social work? It's a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes social change and social development, social cohesion, and the empowerment and the liberation of people. Principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, and respect for diversities are central to social work. Underpinned by theories of social work, social sciences, humanities, and indigenous knowledge, social work engages people and structures to address life challenges and enhance well-being. The above definition may be amplified at national and/or regional levels. If you're not familiar with that, it's well worth pausing here and taking a moment to reread it. As I noted, this is a definition. It's the 3rd definition created collectively by a large group of experts. A lot of thought, a lot of thinking, consideration went into the production of this definition. So as I just said, social work is a distinct profession, and it seems we know exactly who we are. Interesting, huh? I come from a language background. I'm interested in social work and language. What can we say here? Well, social work as a profession, it has its own specialist vocabulary. It has its own words. Now, this is true of any profession. Professions have their jargon, their specific terminology. specific terms with precise meanings. If I use a social work term, another social worker should be understanding that term. If you're a social work student, one of the things you're picking up in your days at the university is a feeling for these terms. Actually, we're teaching you how to understand these terms and use them as they are officially defined. So our terms are describing concepts, methods, values, organizational forms, approaches. Our terms are very, very diverse in terms of what they're doing in our language. Where do these words actually come from? What's the source of these words? This sounds like a very, very complex question, but actually the answer is simpler than you might think. Many of these words come from social work itself. Social work words from the area of social work. Specifically, two places within social work. Social work law. Look at this, I've got a book of German social work law, SGB Act. So many of social work's words can be found in here. This is our jargon. In other words, much of our professional vocabulary is actually legal vocabulary relating to, in this case, children's services law. So law is a great source of our concepts. What's the other source of our concepts? Social work discourses. Hey, you can see the bookcase behind me. Many of those books are social work books, and that's where the words are. An author will write about social work, and the language that author is using, their words, that's the language of social work. So in our own academic jargon, we talk about academic discourses, okay? Academic discourses, and they're filled with the language of social work. Good, so there you are. Many of the words come from social work itself. On the other hand, social work is interdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary, we steal words. We steal terms from outside our field of social work, from our neighboring disciplines, and there's so many of those. So we steal words from psychology, and it becomes our words. We steal words from sociology. These words become our words. Business, philosophy, there's a whole bunch of theology. I can make this list longer. It's probably something like 10 different disciplines that we borrow from. Good, so I was looking at our terminology. I was trying to make a resource for language learners. That resource was going to have two particular parts. One part was going to be some kind of glossary, some kind of list of jargon with translations, but I also wanted to have a learning tool at the same time. At a fairly early point in my project, I looked at our vocabulary, this corpus of terminology that we have, and I thought, hey, what about this question of place? Being born in Britain, I was interested in British English more than American English, and I was mindful of the fact that Americans use different words. Ditto with German. I went to university in Germany, not in Austria or Switzerland. So I was thinking about the way in which language is used in different countries. And I think it's fair to say there's something special about England and Germany. We have quite isolated literature corpora. Britons rarely read US social work textbooks. Now we could, we can read that language, we can easily get them sent over to us, but in practice, British students spend a lot of their time reading books by British authors. Okay, the same is true in Germany. Germans could read Austrian literature, they tend not to quite so much. So many of the books I was reading really were written in Germany. So this is quite fascinating. If I'm a translator and I want to be a little bit precise, I can be a little bit lazy and ignore the language spoken in the countries that I'm not interested in. So we can ignore Austrian German, we can ignore US English if we want to in producing our language tools. Good. Now I'm going to really come to the point. How on earth did I do it? How did I do my vocabulary collecting and also my vocabulary translating? So here you are, translating German and English social work terminology, a how-to guide. This is more than slightly simplified. I'm going to slightly oversimplify it, but it's a fun thing to do. So the point I've just been making, the first step is to restrict your region, okay? I was not ambitious. I didn't want to collect every word used in social work everywhere in the world. Okay, so I said British English and German German. Then pick a topic in the field of social work, whatever it might be: child protection, working with the homeless. Pick a topic, and for that topic, get books from libraries. Now, you can do this digitally if you like. In fact, that has various advantages. I didn't actually. I love the idea of real printed on paper books, so I simply wandered off to my library. It's really good. German libraries are full of UK and US social work textbooks. Never read. You know, I open these books, and it's quite clear that I'm the first person to open them. Sometimes the paper's been miscut and the papers of the pages are still stuck together. So it's kind of funny. I'm often the first person to use these books, but they're there just waiting for me. Not necessarily in my hometown, but the distance lending system works quite well. I got loads of books sent from Cologne. There's a big library in Cologne where most of the books seem to be. So I was very, very lucky. I could get lots of books. I could get a pile of German books and a pile of English books. And then you do your skim reading. Now, if you wanted to, you could be much more technologically supported here. I'm sure if you get the books as ebooks, you could literally pop them into your program and your program would actually collect for terminology. I didn't want to do that. I had studied social work, but I wasn't an expert on all fields of social work. And in the middle of my project, I was aware of the fact that only half of the words I was meeting, I was really happy with. An example, I'd never done a module on gender. I should have actually. That's a very classic, central, modern area of social work thinking, social work theory. We often talk about gender and social work, but it wasn't a topic in my own university degree. So there's a bit of a knowledge gap there. So when I was looking at these books, I was skim reading and I was collecting the vocabulary, but I was also reading to understand the vocabulary, to get my head around this new terminology. So I was using my own background as a social worker to collect the terminology and the jargon. So I was reading these books, skim reading these books, and I was noting the terms. I was making long lists of the terms. Some of them were confusing. If I found a nice definition, if I had notes on the usage, I would annotate my list with that extra information. So as this work progressed, for each one of our little subject fields, as I said, child protection or homelessness, I was quickly getting 2 annotated lists of English and German terminology. Typically, it would suffice to read a few books in each language. You know, if there's one fairly compact area, I'd read a couple of books in each language. If I read a third book in each language, I'd be simply repeating the same words. I would often notice that as a pattern. Obviously, the more you can read, the better, but it's worth noting this whole project is taking huge amounts of time. So in practice, for each field, I would look at least 2 books, and in practice, it was often just 2 or 3 books. Typically, I chose introductions. Typically, I chose books which other people were reading quite a lot as well. So I was producing my list of vocabulary, had a whole bunch of English words here, a whole bunch of German words here. One thing that strikes us, many of these words will be exact equivalents of each other, and you can see it already, you're reading, and you kind of know that these really are the equivalents that we're talking about. However, some will only be near equivalents. Before I started thinking about this, I was guessing that I would find lots of one-to-one translations. And that doesn't really work in social work. We have our terms in the 2 languages, and the thing behind these terms, you know, the things that these words symbolize, are related, but they're only overlapping. They're not one-to-one. And when I was finding a near equivalent, and I was aware that it was only a near equivalent, I was using these little wavy equals lines just to make that point clear. At the end of all of this, you will have 1 or 2 stubborn, difficult little words that are very hard to translate because they don't exist in one of the 2 languages. And this is very, very tricky indeed. This was a source of headaches for me. There's nothing really good you can do. I found the only real way to do this was to somehow be a bit descriptive. I was determined to not create new words. Just because I didn't find a word doesn't mean I should make a new one. So I tried not to do that. I found it to be better to describe a word slightly, to have a very short, compact description, rather than creating a new word that I knew was going to be fake. Once that step's done, and once you've gone through a step of checking, I would use the internet just to check that I really was understanding terms correctly. Once that step's finished, that last checking step, you now have something quite exciting. In your particular area, in my example, homelessness services or child protection, you've got a mini glossary and you've got terms with authentic translations. These translations are not word for word translations, but rather the terms that people use in those two countries. So I was really quite excited producing this thing. So I had lovely little collections of words thematically linked. And now I want to talk about the next step, putting together this learning resource. I had thematic groupings of words and I thought, hey, I can do something really exciting with these words. I made short texts out of these words, something like a side of A4 paper, which is about 400, 450 words. In this text, I'm integrating all of our jargon, all of these words which I'd collected in my research. And I highlighted them in the text, and then I listed them in translation at the bottom of the page. So what you have looks like this. If you look at the left-hand side, you've got this English language text, this is actually chapter 1, filled with basic social work vocabulary in the area of children's services. It's about 450 words long, and at the end the text stops, and then you have all the words which are in italics. So the jargon is in italics, and those words in the same order as they appear are in a long list with their exact translation if there is one, or with their approximate equivalences if that's the best I can find. There you are. This list, of course, that you're seeing at the bottom of this page actually continues onto the next page of the book. Typically, the units therefore had exactly 3 pages in the book printed form. And that's really the end of the presentation. This is all I wanted to tell you about. That's the book that you're seeing there. As I said, this project then became the first step in that exciting second project, and my wonderful colleagues in Jordan managed to change that, transform that into this wonderful thing here. And as you can imagine, with the Arabic script, that project became an even bigger one. The end PDF, I think, was well over 1,000 pages. So there you are, an utterly wonderful thing, an exciting thing to be involved in the production of. When we translated the book into Arabic, we also did something quite nice. We made the whole book longer. Isn't this lovely? Often countries outside of Europe have to battle a little bit to have access to the same resources. Often they don't have access to such up-to-date resources or such extensive resources. Here it was the other way around. Arabic readers actually have a better book. Their book's longer. It has 20 extra units. It's 100 units, not 80. Isn't that nice? So we not only matched the original project, we made it a little bit better. How exciting. There you are. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this interesting project. That Arabic version is actually free online. You can simply put its title into an internet search and you'll quickly find it. It's hosted by the University of Vechta. It's lovely, so you can download that, and if you read Arabic and you want to learn some social work English, all those words are there for you, and there you are, a learning tool. If you don't, of course, simply use the German, which you'll find in your library. Hey, hope you've enjoyed this talk. I've enjoyed giving it. Thanks for listening, guys. Cheerio. Bye.